Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our webinar participants from around the world. Welcome to today's DevX webinar on collecting, analyzing, and communicating about gender data. My name is Kelly Rogers, and I'm an associate editor at DevX based in Bangkok, Thailand. I'm looking forward to moderating this discussion today and hearing from our audience a bit later. Before we get started, I'd like to do a quick sound check to make sure that everyone can hear. So if you can hear me, please type yes into the chat box. Great. Looks like the audio is working fine, and I'm excited to see so many people typing yes. So gender experts across the development industry have long pointed to the collection of gender disaggregated data as a key step in unlocking opportunities for women and girls. But gathering this data is intensely complicated. It's often fraught not just with technical challenges, but political and societal barriers too. Today's conversation will focus on the practical aspects of gender data. We'll move beyond establishing that gender data is important, we know it is, to how exactly practitioners can go about collecting, analyzing, and communicating about gender data. We are joined by three experts who are going to share their knowledge and experience with us today. The first is Yamini Atmavilas from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Yamini is the India lead on gender equality for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's India country office. She leads the Foundation's new work to implement their women's economic empowerment strategy and build gender data and evidence to foster gender transformative policies. She served for nearly 4 years as Senior Program Officer for Measurement, Learning, and Evaluation at the India country office. Before joining the Foundation, Yamini was the Chair of Gender Studies at Administrative Staff College of India in Hyderabad, where she led evaluation, research, and capacity building in human development. We are also joined by Papa Sek from UN Women. Papa is the Chief Statistician at UN Women. Since joining the agency in 2009, he has led statistics and data work and has also contributed to the research work of the agency more broadly. He's currently leading the implementation of UN Women's flagship program initiative on gender statistics, Making Every Woman and Girl Count, to improve the production and use of gender-relevant statistics and to help countries systematically monitor the Sustainable Development Goals from a gender perspective. Prior to joining UN Women, Papa worked for UNDP's Human Development Report Office as a statistics specialist. And finally, we are joined by Albert Motivans of Equal Measures 2030. Albert is Head of Data and Insights for Equal Measures 2030, which is a new multi-sectoral-led data and advocacy initiative that he joined in 2017. He's leading new work on developing innovative approaches to using global data for gender equality in the SDGs. Previously, he was Chief of Education Indicators and Data Analysis at the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, where he oversaw global data work for benchmarking education policies and monitoring international development targets. We're excited to be able to draw on these three speakers' expertise during today's webinar. And before we get started, I did want to note that we'll leave plenty of time to answer your questions at the end. You'll be able to enter questions using the chat box in the ReadyTalk window. Feel free to submit questions at any time during the webinar. I'll be keeping track of them, and we'll try to get to as many as time allows. Also, if you have any technical problems during the webinar, please send a message through the chat box, and one of my colleagues will assist you. And with that, Yamini, I wanted to first turn to you just to address gender data collection. So with your experience developing M&E frameworks, I imagine you have confronted a number of political and societal barriers to collecting sex disaggregated data in the first place. Can you give us an example of one of those experiences and how you overcame those barriers?
Sure. Thanks. First, I'd just like to say that there are political, social, and economic barriers to collecting gender disaggregated data. At the same time, all gender data isn't only gender disaggregated data. I think it's also data that's aimed at understanding particular conditions of women's lives, of women and girls' lives, and their access barriers, their sort of life conditions that are sometimes quite unique. Especially when you start looking at marginalized populations. So I think at the outset, gender data is gender disaggregated data, but also more than that. And one of the big challenges that we often find is that, countries have or states have, historical ways that they've measured something and would like to have maintain comparability, because of which they end up not wanting to change measures that may be better or maybe more useful and significant to compare across countries or across states, or be more accurate measures. And all of these things take a long time to change especially within large and very well-developed statistical systems. And when you start doing good measurement and good M&E designs and systems, you are confronted with first of all, the absence, especially when you're looking at government programs, sometimes the absence of good administrative data that gives you a sense of how and what is happening in programs, in service delivery, in access, and in outreach. And then, of course, especially when you start to evaluate government schemes and programs, you're more often than not met with the challenge of the absence of good baselines. And so, or actually just the absence of a baseline, because, of course, public resourcing is for a program and people just start implementing programs. And so I think one of the biggest challenges I faced in my career as I've started to design and set up evaluations is the absence of good baselines, especially because a lot of the work that I've done has been looking at state programs. And so I'll give you the example of an adolescent girls program that I evaluated, where we were trying to see, with the receipt of bicycles as an incentive to promote girls' school retention, what are the kinds of changes we see, both in terms of school attendance, school retention, as well learning outcomes, as well as the girls' own agency and sort of their own aspiration for more education or continuing their education, and other sorts of aspirations that they might have. And so one of the biggest challenges I faced was actually the absence of any data other than how many girls received the bicycles. So I think you end up then having to, what I ended up doing was having to construct a lot of retrospective assessments, come up with a lot of retrospective measures of girls' agency, and trying to understand, where did, when a class graduates, a class of girls and boys, how do you actually then attribute an incremental improvement in attendance as well as enrollment and retention for girls that's separate, and that's because of a particular intervention. And so I think there are some of these kinds of very practical barriers that you do confront, and in the absence of a lot of data at baseline, you end up, what we ended up doing was, going back into those communities and trying to trace some of these girls back to about 4 to 5 years, and then constructing a counterfactual that was a few years prior to that particular time period. Having said that, of course, we know that there are many more advances that have been made in the measurement of gender disaggregated data. We know a lot more about gender attitudes, about laws, policies, women's healthcare utilization. At the same time, there are many social and political barriers, as you mentioned, and one of them is, of course, the low value of girls' accomplishment, the hidden nature of women's work, the absence of school data that's robust and strong on attendance and continued attendance and retention, absence of good data on school-to-work transitions, which was also something we confronted as we were trying to understand what happens to these girls. Do they have different trajectories because they experience mobility as well as, add 1 or 2 years more of schooling into their own education? So there's quite a few, there were quite a few challenges that I confronted, and in some ways these persist even now as a few years later.
Yeah, you mentioned the importance of stepping back and first formulating and framing what you want to understand about gender first. And you also mentioned, maybe as an example, that the hidden nature of women's work. I'm wondering if you can draw on an example and just sort of quickly run through, what do those steps look like? What does it look like to step back and first frame what you want to understand?
Let's take the example of women's work, and this is one that I think is quite well discussed and well known, so it might be an easy example for us to pick up. So one of the first assumptions we make about women's work or change in women's work status is we look at work only through the lens of remunerative work or paid work, and we only look at it in terms of either work done in the public domain or some forms of informality. But certainly we even today we often neglect to understand that formal and informal work are along a continuum for many of the world's poor women, and there's always a mix of these different kinds of work and occupations they do, and they do it in very simultaneous ways. So a woman might be cooking for her family, but also be cooking to sell the same thing in the market. And so the third sort of form of work, which we call unpaid work, then becomes part of that continuum as well. And so I do think that our understandings of women's work needs to be very conceptually strong. Otherwise, we end up only looking at one part of it rather than the entire spectrum of women's contributions. Another example is migration, and this is a classic example where, again, we tried to understand the nature of women's migration, and most surveys, most of the understandings of women's migration are very related, at least in South Asia, are very much related to marriage migration. And so we just don't have very good, first of all, we assume that, when you talk about migration, it's male migration. And secondly, that women's migration is only related to change of residence when they get married. And so the concept of women's labor migration is often left out of a lot of our conceptual framings, and we end up, that just ends up being a blank, an invisible sort of part of our work when we try to measure.
Absolutely. Thanks, Yamini. Papa, I want to turn to you to talk a little bit about data analysis. So we know that UN Women is helping governments and other groups analyze collected data and to use it to close gaps and inform their work. So I'm wondering, what are you learning about the budget or the processes? What's needed for these actors to do that successfully?
Yes, thank you very much. So I think just to step back a little bit, one thing that we basically as an organization we realized early on once the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed is that we just didn't have the information that we needed to actually see where we are, if we are making progress towards those objectives, or essentially what is the fruit of the work that we are doing, supporting governments from the policy point of view and from the programmatic point of view. And so that's the reason why we've launched our new program in September 2016 during the UN General Assembly, and it's called Making Every Woman and Girl Count. And as part of this program, essentially what we try to do is to support countries to make sure that they can analyze, they can produce the data that we need to produce to monitor the SDGs, to increase demand at the national level. And I'll come to those challenges that you asked about just in a minute, because I think that's where we are really finding that this is where the bottleneck is when it comes to some of the issues that Yamini just mentioned, which is the data production, but also particularly on the data use side. Improving demand at the national level is key, but also supporting the production of the data that we need. And finally, the third aspect of the program is really to support data analysis, data use, and obviously greater dissemination in the process. And the program is both at national, regional, and global levels. And through such an integrated system, essentially, we really are able to address the challenges that come from different levels. So at the global levels, for instance, it's an issue of coordination that is a huge challenge. At the regional level, there are some region-specific issues. For instance, what is true in East Asia is not true in Sub-Saharan Africa. There are some challenges that are common, but obviously some that are really region-specific. And finally, at the national level, where I think the bulk of the work really happens. One of the three components of the program are basically improving the integration of gender in national statistics plans and strategies. And here we focus quite a bit on advocacy to increase the demand for gender statistics. And again, one of the challenges that we have is that when it comes to the national perspective in particular, we see that demand is not so strong because policymakers themselves do not always appreciate the importance of gender statistics to inform policies. And really focusing on advocacy here is really important in order to bring the users into even a discussion on gender on statistics. Then there's the issue of data production, and here, supporting data production really aims to address one glaring issue. We have very little of the data that we need to monitor the SDGs at this point. Improving also the use of administrative sources. And here, from the user perspective, essentially what we are learning is that there's a lot of data that is being produced, but that is outside of the national official statistical system. And this is really data that comes from regular programming that line ministries do, particularly women's ministries, but also civil society and so on. And the tools that they want are basically things that can enable them to actually use the data that they generate through their own programming, and really make it into more of a feedback loop where basically they are able to generate the data, use that data to improve their own services. And that's, I think, one key element that we are learning that we didn't really take into account when we first started this program. So increasingly, the countries where we are working are addressing those challenges. Then finally, and I'll spend a bit the rest of the time on the issue of data accessibility and data use. And here we are supporting better data dissemination and secondary policy analysis, increasing dialogue between both users and producers, who sometimes, and in most cases, in fact, we are finding out do not always talk to each other. And that's a huge challenge, I think. Again, the last point that Yamini was addressing was the issue of framing. And framing can only come from those who know the issues well. And statisticians are not always the best place to do that. Obviously, they can do some of the primary analysis that comes from, let's say, surveys and so on. But the deeper policy analysis can only come from people who understand gender concerns, and really, I think, and it goes beyond statistics. And that's the reason why we are really focusing on improving a dialogue between users and producers, so that users can know what is being produced, but producers are also sensitive to users' needs. And finally, the last bit is on training and increasing data literacy of civil society organizations. So just very recently, UN Women, as part of this process, this program published a new report, which is Turning Promises into Action, Gender Equality in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And these are really the types of analysis that we are encouraging, not only we are doing here at headquarters level, but also that we are encouraging countries to do. Because it goes beyond just the simple monitoring of the SDGs, and it goes into really analyzes some of the issues that are really relevant at the national level. So one thing that we found through this report is the fact that the challenges that we have currently are really daunting. We have less than one third of the data that we need to monitor the gender-related targets in the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is as much to do with lack of data production as lack of poor data dissemination strategies by national statistical systems. And for us, for most policymakers and gender advocates that we've talked to, one thing that we've learned is that sometimes they don't even know where to look for the information that they need. And other times they continuously have to chase data producers and get little to no support to understand the data that are being given to them. So in those instances, it's really hard for them to then take that data and be able to use it for policy purposes. So going beyond the statistical aspect and really informing policy. And so as part of this program, one thing that we're doing is really focusing on making sure that the data are accessible to them, but also giving training and also financial support and the tools that they need in order to change this picture. So, for instance, there are data literacy programs that we are developing whose aim is really to make sure that at least the basics of gender statistics are available to them and they are able to understand them. But then, at the national level, we also want to go beyond just the indicators. Here on the screen, there's an analysis that is coming out of the report that I just mentioned, where we are looking at inequality at the national level, and this is absolutely critical if we are going to meet the SDGs, to know which groups are being left behind. And so the analysis for Pakistan, for instance, shows that wealth, location, ethnicity, and so on play a huge role in determining who's being left behind at the national level. And these are some of the types of analysis that we are also promoting at the national level. And again, this only comes from through a collaboration between both data producers but data users, including policymakers, but also civil society organizations.
Thanks so much, Papa. You did a great job, I think, touching on the dialogue between data users and producers and the challenges that arise in knowing, I think, where to look for the data they need. And I think that's a pretty good segue to Albert. I know that Equal Measures 2030 has charged itself with ensuring data is transformed into advocacy and action by putting easy-to-use data and evidence into the hands of women's groups or rights advocates. So I wonder if I could start by asking you, what is considered easy-to-use gender data?
Oh, thank you, Kelly. Yeah, easy to use. I think it's a good term that covers several important concepts related to data and statistics on gender issues, and some of them we've heard about already. So just to take another cut on it and maybe extend the list a little bit from what we've heard already from Papa and Yamini. One, easy to use data, it's available. It's being collected regularly in a consistent way. And we know that in the gender space there are still big gaps, as was mentioned, but there are efforts that are working with government statistical offices to improve measurement frameworks and to extend data availability, and that includes the work of the UN Women's flagship program, Data 2X, Paris 21, amongst others. And we see our role as kind of connecting then these data and the data that comes from these official sources to better to be more available then to advocates and decision makers, with the aim of then fueling progress towards gender equality. Easy to use data is accessible, so it's made public in a timely and easy way. And we also see now that there's been so many advancements in terms of technologies which are making the communication of data and the accessibility of data much more interactive than ever before, much more visual than ever before. So it really opens up this idea of communicating to a much wider audience. And there's so many players working in this space: Tableau, Flowminder, and many others that are helping to make it more accessible at the global level, and then working with partners in countries at the national level as well. But it's not only about availability and accessibility when we think about easy to use, and other aspects of being easy to use then look back to what we've heard about around data collection and data analysis, and really that idea of framing that came up from the very beginning with Yamini about really understanding that these data aren't just to create new indicators or to produce indicators. They really should be aligned to national priorities. And these data and evidence are much more likely to be used, or are much easier to be used if they address the needs, the information needs, and the policy concerns of national, and not only national, but even subnational stakeholders. So it's about being aligned to policies. Easy to use data is about being actionable. So again, it's not about kind of abstract notions, although sometimes that can lead to changes and developments that we didn't expect. But also it should be used to make decisions. It should help to inform decisions. It should be information then which is valuable to policymakers, to advocates, to kind of really find some traction on an issue. And I think this is something that's really important as well. And at equal measures, we think that composite indicators or indexes are useful tools to communicate data as well. They can reach a wider audience, and they meet many of these criteria for easy-to-use data that I just described. They can help provide a more comprehensive picture and an easy way to communicate kind of a summary measure of progress across what we see as a very complex set of gender issues. And we see that there's actually quite a bit of activity in this space, that there's many different indexes, and those we're familiar with, like those from the World Economic Forum, UNDP, and then even those more recently in the past year, the Women, Peace and Security Index and the Women Leadership Index from Georgetown Institute and the Wilson Center here in Washington, which are breaking new grounds in these areas. And then we're also at the beginning of a process to construct a global index around the gender-related SDG targets and the data collected by UN agencies and UN Women and others. And we think this is important because we think that there's a need to provide a summary measure or a comprehensive picture of progress in a summary way across gender equality issues in the SDGs, which doesn't now exist. And as Papa pointed out already, there are challenges there because some of the data don't exist currently or only exist for a few countries. So we think it's important to complement some of these official indicators with other types of measures, including perceptions around social norms and other gender issues, policy types of indicators, some of which we do see in the SDG framework, but there's a whole range of additional policy indicators that are available now. And then looking at other sources of information, so data generated by girls and women through the different platforms that exist now in many countries. We started this exercise by identifying some of these information needs and policy priorities from regional and national girls and women's advocates, and we're looking for recommendations from a technical panel that's been formed to set out a proposal for a broader consultation. So we do welcome all of you listening to take part in this consultation. It'll begin in early March when we're launching a consultation side event during the CSW events in New York at the UN, and we can provide more information on this. So this index is kind of at a very global level. So we understand that the constituency is not just concerned about the global level, but that it is an important entry point for advocacy. But we really want to look at how we develop new approaches, including integrating some of these new technologies and more qualitative information that respond to gender-related themes at the national and subnational level. And so we're also directly engaged with 6 national gender advocacy organizations in the countries I think that you can see on the slide there, Colombia, El Salvador, India, Indonesia, Kenya, and Senegal. And we're tailoring data and messages around specific national influencing that these advocacy groups are doing. And we're covering a variety of themes such as child marriage, women in decision-making, land security, land tenure, and girls in secondary education. So we're trying to balance, we're trying to bring the global down to the local and connect this data and evidence with advocacy and action on the ground.
Thanks, Albert. And just to sneak in one more question for you, you're speaking of complementing indicators with other data, other sources. Just briefly, what should groups know about where they're getting this data from, or maybe what data to trust? I know there are plenty of gaps, and so there is the plethora of data, but I think it's still an important question.
Right. Yeah. No, I think it is. I think that's a good one of the most important challenges as a barrier for using gender data for advocacy. And I think one of the issues was touched upon by Pop already, which is really this idea of making data understandable and being an informed data user. Really, this mantra of know your data is not only important for researchers, but really important for advocates and really important for policymakers. Because as my former Dutch director said, using a Dutch saying, an old Dutch saying is that trust comes by foot, but it leaves by horseback, meaning that credibility is really an important issue for advocates, and really understanding the data sources and interpreting the data in a way that's informed, I think is really important. I think there's things that can be done, that to make this more understandable, to be able to present data in a clear way and provide descriptive analysis, including definitions or talking about sources of bias and error, and demystifying the technical jargon. Because I think that for many advocates, there are many advocates that are well informed in data use, but there are also others where it does become kind of a technical jargon that needs to be demystified. And I think there's some real simple concepts. Even the most common indicator is typically a rate or a ratio, which is really a very simple concept. It's really looking at a population affected and looking at a larger population as one example. It's not a complex concept, but it's not always well explained. There's other concepts like stocks and flows, prevalence and incidence, which are really vital for making advocacy and for making the right decisions to understand, when you would use a prevalence indicator, when you would rather use something which looks more at incidence or the number of new cases of an issue. And to try to look at gender issues from different perspectives. Public finance data is very intimidating for many people to use. But even understanding something simple as the different kinds of information that you could get from looking at absolute measures, such as in monetary metric, or relative measures such as a share of GDP per capita, how you can use those spending data together, looking at both absolute and relative sides, how that can inform an issue, I think is something that can be really valuable for advocates. But just coming back to the idea around what can you trust, what can't you trust? I really think that it's about having as many data as possible in some ways. There's things that you can do to kind of judge the face validity, but oftentimes you may not have the metadata or the description to really go much further. And I think in that case one has to use those data with caution. But I think more measurement and more data, and not necessarily new data, but existing data, it's a good thing, because it's not just about one indicator. It's not just about one data source. All the data sources have different types of flaws, different kinds of issues. It would be very difficult to find any perfect data. And it's almost like a forensic type of exercise where, by putting together these different views and these different clues, that can better tell a story about the lived realities of girls and women. And I think, putting into that mix, I think that's where, kind of more qualitative approaches or kind of small-scale research, can also, shed light on how we look at some of these national level, very highly aggregated types of information. And then also the data that comes from different places. It was mentioned already, the use of program data, and that could be a useful source. But then it's really important that the advocacy groups themselves also, ensure that the rigor of that data and to look for support where needed to achieve that.
Thanks so much, Albert. I have so many more questions for each of you, but I've seen a lot of questions coming in from our audience, so I'd like to open our conversation up to a Q&A. And we had a couple of questions that came in ahead of time via email. And one of those, Yamini, I think you might be best placed to answer this. What skills are required to collect good gender data? This is important so that the process should not be seen as being extractive, but also useful to the women themselves.
Great question. I think those are more than just skills. I think it's a combination of good data skills as well as a real ethical positioning of oneself and why one is collecting data, as well as the recognition that data as well as its absence is political. And so I think having this sort of broad positioning of oneself, whether one is a commissioner of data collection or or an evaluator or a statistician oneself, we're not empty vessels. And so really understanding and knowing that that you are positioned within a certain context and are collecting information, and that data does create certain kinds of power and certain kinds of political asymmetry is very important for us to understand. Having said that, I would say that going back to our original sort of understanding of this question of framing, I'm a very theory-driven person, and I think also, like Papa said, statisticians are great, and I think they're really critical to helping us, stay true to science and develop good, robust measures and really understand, ways to converse some really important questions about gender and the lived experiences of women and girls in very robust ways. But at the same time, I would say the first skill or precondition would be to really understand who and what you're trying to understand, and there being rooted in theory and being rooted in understandings of inequality, social positioning, the kind of population that you're working with, questions of inequality and marginalization, especially when it comes to marginalized populations. It's very easy to miss certain groups because they're not even in the reckoning for data collection unless you set up your work in a way that is mindfully inclusive of wanting to capture experiences or data from all strata of society. And so I would say the first thing would be to have a very strong, broad understanding of the context and a really strong theoretical understanding of what you're trying to measure and why. And then I would say definitely this awareness that, data collection should not be extractive, but, so really trying to think through ways that you can either make collection participatory, or B, even going back to the original setting up of the survey or the evaluation or research, making sure that communities that you're doing research with are part of the framing and the generation of the hypotheses, part of the generation of the tools, and are really partners in the research as well as in use of that data for their own communities and for their own sort of well-being. However, having said that, I will say that this happens very rarely, and unfortunately, and so it's something that we need to get better at, number one, and number two, find ways to build these kinds of data systems that are accessible and more transparent with communities and are much more grounded in the communities that we're doing research or collecting data with. A third set of skills, I would say, is of course being good in terms of developing strong, robust measures, knowing the field, making sure that the kinds of data and information you're trying to collect do meet certain kinds of standards, but at the same time recognize that where measures don't exist. And so one of the examples is, of course, of the measurement of empowerment, which is now, continues to be a very exciting field and a space of great innovation. At the same time, knowing that some of these indicators and some of these kinds of measures are dynamic and change over time. And so being really deeply rooted in the field and being deeply rooted in the world of measurement is very, very important. And then I'd say a fourth is being open, and so being really open in terms of both the qualitative as well as quantitative metrics, and recognizing that, as Albert also said, there are many, many interesting new ways of capturing information and data that's not necessarily, just a simple survey instrument or like hundreds of multiple choices, but that, using ICT, using ways that are using means that are cost effective but also don't take a lot of time, so that your survey doesn't then become another burden on poor women's time, for example. I think some of these are really critical to bear in mind, and I agree. I mean, I think at the end of the day, making sure that you go back to the communities where the data was collected and making it available in some form or the other that's usable by them for their own sort of planning or advocacy, whatever the case might be, is really important.
Thanks so much, Yamini. So a couple of questions have come in, and I'm going to combine them in a way. This audience member is asking the panel for guidance on asking for and collecting data on LGBTQI and third gender, as it's referred to in some countries such as Nepal. And someone else asked something along the same lines about inclusion. Who gets lost when we organize data into two binary categories, women and men, and how do we address inequalities that arise precisely by not belonging to one of these groups? And I'm not sure, Papa or Albert, if one of you would want to tackle this one.
Yeah, so I'm happy to chime in on that. So this is actually, I think, one of the issues that we consider as frontier issues when it comes to monitoring, so measuring gender, collecting gender data. Because obviously gender is not a binary concept, and one thing that we've found is that data on LGBTQI or third gender, as just mentioned, is currently very rare. There are a few attempts to try to address those questions. And some examples that I can mention is, for instance, Australia and New Zealand have recently been experimenting with measures of basically, true measures of gender identity when it comes to their surveys, and there is there's some promising some promising research has been done in that sense, and hopefully essentially one thing that might happen is that in these countries they will start to incorporate those measures into into their regular data production cycle. And another example actually is the United Kingdom. The UK actually did a test to see if, for instance, they changed the question in their census. Basically included a question on gender identity. If it would result in much of a change in terms of the response rates. And one thing that they found is that essentially the response rates did not change very much, and the question was well answered. And I believe they also did a purposive sampling survey of focusing on gender identity, where they had, I think, 100,000 respondents. And if you visit the UK National Statistical Office's website, you will find the study there, and it's quite interesting. And I would encourage anyone who's interested in this tool to actually look at it. Some of the findings are really quite innovative. And finally, the last example is that for Nepal, there's been a survey done by a team called the Individual Deprivation Measure. And they did a survey in Nepal looking at issues around multidimensional poverty, but I believe that one of the questions that they tried to address was the whole issue of gender identity, and they managed to include a question on gender identity in the survey. So I'm happy again to put anyone who's interested in touch with the researchers who have done the survey.
Thanks so much, Papa. So we're also having a lot of questions about an effort to put all of this data in a central location so that we can access it. So for instance, one audience member said that they looked at Equal Measures and UN Women's websites but can't seem to access raw data there. Are there any suggestions on where to go to access gender data in a central location? And someone else asked, would the creation of a platform displaying good practices regarding, for example, how gender data have positively impacted the development of policies be useful? And Albert, I thought you would be a good one to tackle this.
Sure, and perhaps Papa could also chime in from the UN Women's side, because there may be new developments in relation to their gender portal as well. We're in the process of putting together a platform as we speak, and we're hoping to launch it in September. But there are many other sources that one can look to. There's the gender portal at the UN Statistical Division. The World Bank has a gender portal. I think there are some of these global efforts, but as well there's things that are also happening at the regional level. So some of the economic commissions in Latin America and the Caribbean and Asia also have, and in Africa, also have data resources that one could look to. But it is true, it would be, I think, useful to to try to bring together these data, and I think that's part of that is I think as it's foreseen under the program at UN Women. But in terms of, let's see, what was the other question was about the best practices, right? So there are some efforts there, and I think that is really important to show. And I think showing this power of data, building the demand for the use of data and evidence in improving gender equality is something which is really needed, but very hard to get sometimes. We're in the midst of a survey of advocates around the world, for civil society organizations around the world, and we're actually asking questions about this. But also there are others like Data 2X, which has a big initiative now to try to draw out some of these stories, and then hopefully there will be some way to build a resource around where to look for good examples and what worked in what context. I think then it might be easier to identify, why a specific gender issue resonated politically in one context where it might not in another, and so that I think would be a very helpful undertaking. But so there are these few initiatives that already exist or that are ongoing, and I think you'll see a lot more activity in the coming months.
Thanks, Albert.
Yes. So just
Yamini,
to add.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Papa.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add that.
No, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add that. So, for instance, as part of the, I talked about the report that we produced recently, and on our website, you will find essentially you can have access to all the data that was used to in the report. So, including data at the country level, but essentially all the data that was used in the report. But more importantly, what we are, as Albert has just mentioned, we are developing a portal currently, and the portal will be launched during the World Data Forum which will take place in Dubai in October. And the portal is essentially going to provide all the information on SDGs, gender-related SDGs indicators. And what the user will be able to do is also to play with the data and export it into different formats, different charts, and so on. As part of this portal, we will also provide information on some of the resources on gender statistics, particularly the resources that we are currently using at the national level to support countries.
Thanks, Papa. And Yamini, I wanted to squeeze in a question because a number of people have asked for us to return to one of the examples that you gave in the beginning of the webinar about how you resolve the lack of government data. There's one question posed saying we are currently implementing a program in Pakistan for education for girls, but retention and graduation rates seem hard to collect at the school level. And then perhaps more broadly, someone else has asked, countries may have historic ways they've measured things and want to keep the comparability over time, which is something that you mentioned earlier. How would you approach this situation to increase the production and availability of gender data?
Two very
easy, right?
Very tough questions to answer. Yes. I mean, on the education data, look, I mean, historically we have what we have, but I think there are some very good examples of cost-effective and quick ways that data on learning outcomes, school attendance, etc., are being collected. For example, in India, the annual survey on education, the USER report that comes out nationally is something that's done in a very, very quick way and very cost effectively, and collects data on millions of schools and millions of school kids in terms of their attendance as well as learning outcomes. So I think there are some interesting examples of ways that this can be set up. In terms of schools collecting these, recording them on their own, and it's not something I'm very clear which countries have better or worse quality data, but I think there's something that at a systemic level that needs to be addressed, especially for girls, because when you look at most countries, you have fairly strong enrollment and completion of girls in primary schooling and even enrollment in secondary schooling. But when you start to look at micro-studies or surveys that are outside of the government system that are asking girls about their attendance or what their learning outcomes are, especially on attendance, you find very, very low attendance levels as the girls move into puberty and beyond. And so I guess I'm just sort of stating that there are these challenges, but there are some good best practices that we can draw upon. And then in terms of the comparability versus, keeping up with better indicators, I think this is a challenge that we all face, whether it's government systems or our own sort of evaluation surveys where we may have come up with a set of indicators and a set of measures that change at baseline that might have changed by the time you go back and in line where programs have matured and have taken on other kinds of issues, and so at the same time, you may also recognize, for example, that certain kinds of questions around, let's say, decision making or mobility, if it comes to women's empowerment, that they may not be the things that tell you the most interesting or important things about what's changing in those women's lives because of your own interventions or their own agency building work. So I think this is a classic challenge, and I guess the way to get I don't know that there are many big ways there are very benchmark ways to get around it, but I will say that it's somewhere where you can sort of hold on to a certain, maybe it's a bit of innovation in terms of your sampling or innovations in terms of the levels at which data is collected, so that you decide what the trade-offs are, so that at certain higher, more aggregated levels, perhaps you hold on to certain measures for sake of comparability, but then at more granular levels, you can build in the newer, more interesting, or more updated ways of measures, so that they become more usable to policymakers and decision makers. Having said that, as you know, there are so many gaps that we have, both at a national administrative level as well as just from a measurement perspective, in terms of just where robust and validated measures are and where they are still a work in progress.
Thanks, Yamini. I'm going to try and rapid fire at least 2 more questions. Papa, we've gotten a lot of questions about what strategies or arguments have you found most successful in convincing national governments of the importance of collecting and sharing gender disaggregated data?
Yeah, so I think, and this was a surprise to me, usually they don't take much convincing. So the importance of data, and particularly now that we are entering the era of SDGs, is widely accepted. I think the challenges that we have is basically making sure that the recognition of that importance gets translated into more resources, for instance, for national statistical offices, and that's not always the case. Because we know that national statistical systems in general are hugely underfunded, and that's, I think, where we have such a challenge. And this is where we, for instance, work with countries to make sure that we address gender issues in national statistical development strategies, which are long-term strategies that can ensure essentially more predictable funding for gender data. But also the issue that I mentioned is really increasing data literacy, and by working with policy makers and so on, you really draw their interest, and the more they recognize the importance of that information, the more they demand it from national statistical offices. And again, once you start building those capacities, then you do get into a virtuous cycle. So, for instance, in Uganda, we are working both with the National Statistical Office to really address the issues from a technical perspective, but we also work with all the line ministries, particularly the women's gender ministry, in order to ensure that they are kept in the loop. They are as much a stakeholder into the program as the National Bureau of Statistics, but also the other constituents, such as the Makerere University, which is also, I think, more on the research side, but also quite interested in gender issues. And there, what you do is that you help to build the capacities of the next generation of leaders, which are students, and making sure that we address really the whole issue from throughout the chain. So it's not just one constituent, but it's all of them. So working with users, policymakers, producers, but also academia and civil society and so on. So I think that it's only through such a holistic approach that we can really help tackle the issue.
Thanks, Papa. Albert, I was going to sneak in one more question for you, but we have unfortunately come to the end of our scheduled time for this webinar. I really thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm really impressed with the engagement, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and I hope we can keep it going. Once you exit the webinar, a survey will appear in your browser. So if you have a couple of minutes, 2 minutes, in fact, we would really appreciate your feedback about this webinar and your ideas for future events. And if you want to watch the webinar again, we'll be emailing it to you shortly and posting it on devx.com. So look out for that in the near future. And that's also where you'll be able to find the articles we referenced today. Again, thank you so much to Yamini, Papa, and Albert for taking the time to speak with us today. On behalf of DevX, I want to thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you'll join us for our next digital event.